I don't know what's happening, but this is now the fourth time that we get cut off, that the meeting gets cut off completely. You're muted, Maheshwar. If you hear me.
Yeah, I think it was it was because I accidentally left the meeting and then I canceled it for everyone, but it won't happen again.
Okay.
Thanks, Maheshwar. I'll give everyone a couple more minutes. There's a few people that are nearly there, I think. Okay, well, I think I'll kick off again. So hopefully everyone can hear me. And yeah, as I was saying, I'll be mindful of trying to give everyone space to contribute. And if I do sort of keep things rolling, it's just because I have a bit of a framework so we can get through the discussion in 90 minutes, giving a bit of space for discussion, but also mindful of a bit of a process. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. If you're not sure, well, I'm assuming almost everyone or everyone is familiar with Prout, but there might be one or two new people. But basically, a Prout is a socio-economic theory developed by Prabhat Sarkar or P.R. Sarkar, an Indian philosopher and spiritual thinker in the 20th century, mid to late mid 20th century, and it's kind of like what he called progressive socialism. So it's definitely a modern economic theory, and that tries to find a third way, if you like, between socialist thinking, economic thinking, and capitalist economic thinking. And I was thinking about it the other day, just reading a book on modern monetary theory. It actually has probably quite a lot of parallels with what we now call modern monetary theory, but there's plenty of other ideas out there in the world that Prout kind of aligns with, if that makes sense. New economic thinking. So that's Prout. So we're kind of, yeah, we're probably a pretty big group. So what I might do is just jump in and I'll get you to introduce yourself as we go through rather than before we start. That'll make sense in a minute. But welcome everyone. So housing affordability is the topic. So what I'd like you to do for this first 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is just look at what is the issue and why it's important. So I'd like you to reflect on housing affordability. Just think about the idea for a couple of minutes, and I'd like you to think about these two questions. Why is housing affordability important? Why do you think it's important that housing is kept affordable? And I know that might sound pretty straightforward, but why do you think it's important that we have housing affordability in society? And the second one to think about just for 2 or 3 minutes is how housing affordability an issue in your community, where you live, in your society at the moment? Is housing affordability an issue? So first part of the question is why is housing affordability important? And the second one is it an issue in your area? And if so, like, have a think about what that issue is. Why is it an issue and what it is, how to describe the issue. So if you'd like to think about those two things and either put something into chat, if you're comfortable putting something into chat, which is obviously just type it in, or just have it in your mind, and we'll go around the room, the e-room, the virtual room in a minute. But I'll just give you a couple of minutes. So if you'd like to really think about, one, why is this such an important issue? And two, is it an issue in your area? And if so, just describe the issue. Just really briefly, give us a summary. So have a think about that for a minute or so, and then we'll go around and get some thoughts from everyone in the meeting. I'll kick it off while you're thinking about that to say that I live in Australia, so obviously in a developed country, although yeah, sometimes you wonder. And I live in a rural area or a regional town actually, but I work in rural communities as mainly, so not in large urban cities. But the issue of housing affordability is a massive issue across Australia, and even rural land now is becoming unaffordable for family farming communities. But yeah, so it's a very big issue in our area, and it's basically meaning that the average earning person in the country is finding it more and more. It's increasingly hard to actually buy, and if you're renting, then in some areas, not all of Australia, but in some areas of Australia, it's becoming harder and harder for the average earning person to rent, and rent not being too much of a burden on their weekly income. So yeah, it is a massive issue across Australia in one way, shape or form. Okay, so I've got a few chats coming in. So hopefully people have had a little bit of time to think about why they think housing affordability is an issue, and then is it an issue in your specific community, and just describing that issue in your community. And we'll dig into the causes in a little bit, but I just want to get a description of the issue. So we've got a couple of things on chat, so I'll start with them. Michael's put in there, housing is a necessity of life. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I wasn't trying to ask a trick question. It is such a basic, essential need, and I guess that's why it's so important. And Bill's put in there, from Mike, following on from Michael, exactly. It's like food, clothing, medical care. Without the basics, all the rest is impossible. Yeah, great. And I guess, thinking about it, when you have somewhere secure to live, that you feel secure, then psychologically, apart from the physical protection and physical shelter that you have, but psychologically, it's very important that as a human we feel a place of belonging and a place of security. So having, whether you're renting or you own a property, or you're trying to own a property, a house, I guess it's important that humans have somewhere like a base to live. Psychologically, that's critical as well as physically, giving us a base to live. Yeah, so Andy's putting there that it's basically one of those basic needs that affect. Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to fulfill those other aspirations, Andy, like education, jobs, without the stability of having somewhere to live. And that's the problem with transient people that have to move a lot. It can be very hard to then fulfill other areas of your life. Yep, feeds into prison, mental health, etc. Great. Yeah. So yeah, I know that sounded like a pretty obvious question, but I think it's important that we're really clear as to why this topic's important. And from a Prout point of view, it is seen as an essential basic need for humans. So I guess it raises that point. Well, if our societies, our communities around the world, and our social economic systems around the world are not meeting that need, then I guess we have to question how effectively they are being operated. Okay, so then I guess the thing there, David's got in, Dada's put in there, so many housing is a major proportion of their income, showing this inequality, quality, comfort, location. Yeah, great. Thanks, Dada. Yeah, that's right. So this is the problem, is that the financial stress and the ability to purchase or to afford some quality housing is becoming more difficult for more and more people. Okay, so I'd like to get some specific examples from people. Yeah, thanks, Simandas. Yeah, SDG, Simandas is putting as the basic needs, the major problem to achieve SDG. I'm assuming that's sustainable development goals, Simandas. Gonna have to clarify that one, but I think that's what you mean. Yeah, great, thank you. Thanks for that. So I guess it'd be good to get some specific examples. So obviously I just touched on one, a broad one in Australia. But does anyone else have any very specific examples of the issue of homelessness? Not necessarily the causes, or we're going to get to the causes, because there's obviously quite a few different factors that are influencing it, depending where you are. But just some specific examples of homelessness, or sorry, housing affordability in different communities around the world. So yeah, and I think thinking about it myself over the last couple of weeks before today, there's obviously in different places and different situations, whether in a developed country or developing country, and even within countries in different regions, so rural versus urban, tourist areas versus non-tourist areas, there's quite different specifics to the example of housing affordability. So I'll start with data. I might have plugged in under something into chat, and then I might see if anyone wants to contribute verbally. The data's given the example in Portugal, especially Lisbon and Porto. So obviously the big cities of Portugal. Gentrification is a serious issue. So you've got areas that traditionally were working class data. If you look at the definition of gentrification, it's usually where working class areas of a city get sort of bought up by middle to upper middle class, usually an upper class people who then drive up the price of housing in those districts. And those districts are often where, if we use the concentric zonal sociology theory of the Chicago School of Sociology from the early days, that zone in the city was where the working class people lived because it was close to the work. And so obviously you then get issues of transport and time to work and all of these other issues that come up because those working class people are forced further and further out of the city centre where they may be expected to work.
And also most of that housing then goes to things like Airbnb. So it's also displacement of a permanent population and dependency on tourism, etc.
Yeah, so then you get this other dimension on top of that, which is then it's not even used for people to live there permanently. It's used for the tourism business in this case. Yeah, so you get that social change in the use, and you have a lot of empty houses. Sumandas, the number of homeless people in Bangladesh is increasing every year due to climate change. So yeah, right. So you've got literally got environmental pressures that are causing loss of homes. So, Sumandas in Australia, that's not yet an issue, but obviously in developing countries where the climate is more of a risk, although I mean, most countries have risk of climate, but in particularly extreme disturbances like there where you are, then yeah, it sounds like that's pretty dire and people are physically losing access to home even if they could afford it or not. And I think probably some of the Pacific Island nations, Sumandas, are in that same boat. And Sumandas, I'm not sure whether your what's it called, audio works, but if it does, feel free to jump in on that more if you want to add anything to it. But thank you very much for putting that into chat. Does anyone else want to throw in specific examples? We've had an example from Portugal and Australia. If you do, just put your hand up. And then I can go to, so Suveda, you're in Bangkok, I think, in Thailand. Yeah.
Yes, but at this stage, I might like to share some experience that I heard from my friend yesterday about situation in Japan. That the house pricing has increased, like fluctuated very very quickly, or for example, that they had Olympics before, and the price of the house in Tokyo just gone up significantly, and then it come down after that Olympic event. So the people who bought the house at that time, like in my friend's case, that he has to be in the debt for 77 years to buy a house, and he's be about 40 or 50, almost 50 years old. So that about maybe when the time you retire or not, after retire, you still haven't yet finished house paying your debt.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one example that happened in Tokyo.
Yeah, and these problems of affordability and then debt. And so one, is there enough housing for people of a reasonable quality? And then two, if you can afford it with purchasing power from your earnings in your salary, or if not, then do you get into debt get caught in a debt situation because of the economic system that's in place, and obviously Australia and other wealthy countries that have really high real estate prices is where debt becomes the norm for you to even have half a chance of owning. You're then caught on a high debt situation, and then things like bubbles, real estate bubbles, and things like events like the Olympics can cause that pricing to go up even more. We'll just have a look. Thank you very much, Suveda, for that. And I know it's early there in Bangkok, so thanks for joining us. Michael's got in there, empty homes is an indicator that houses not being purchased as dwellings. Yeah, so in Melbourne, 6% of houses a year are vacant. Yeah, great. So you've got a lot of homes that are owned. People own more than one home, and some of them, they own homes that are not being used, or they've been used for tourism, like Airbnb, or just not being used at all and they're empty. And so we're getting houses being used as for speculative investment. So I guess the question is, if people are investing in second and third homes, which is this big real estate thing in developed countries where people put their money into more houses as their kind of investment to make more money, they just keep buying houses. Why are they putting it into that and not into things like new small businesses that employ other people? And rather they put it into these kind of quite static ways of Bitcoin or real estate, instead of investing their money into businesses that employ people and make things, particularly renewable things, etc. Andy lives in the US. In some cities, the concentration of industries such as tech industry. Sorry, Andy, that just bumped up. I'm thinking of San Francisco. Yep, pushes up the cost of real estate incredibly high. Yeah, pushing out many working class people, and I guess that sounds similar to Australia in many areas of Australia anyway, that whether it's because of tech industry or tourism or just general bubble mania, real estate bubble mania, is dislocating particularly people of working class and lower middle class people. Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. Yeah. Kivali, Anti's from Finland, I'm pretty sure, and I probably have pronounced that right. Housing is also well subsidised here in Finland for anyone with a minimal to low income, and that money, of course, goes to the landlords. So there is a common investment scheme where one gets a loan from the bank, buys apartments from the city, and rents it to the people who get these housing benefits. So taxes go to the owners and banks. Right, I see what you mean. So they do have a social housing scheme, which is kind of like funded through using investors, property investors, to sort of drive the system. If I've got it right there, but the general wealth is going back to the owners and the banks at the same time through that borrowings and tax benefits for people that want to go into that system and can afford to go into that as a landlord. That's right, Andy.
Yeah, and that also raises the prices, of course.
Yes, yeah. And there is that subsidization, but then the cost of subsidizing is going up as well at the same time as if the whole thing's on that upward cycle. Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And I lived in Sweden many years ago, so back in the 90s, and I was aware, I didn't quite fully understand it back then. I was a bit caught up doing other things, but I was aware that I think there's a similar thing across some of our Scandinavian countries.
They have also their totally own systems, like they can have a mortgage for 100 years.
Yes. Yeah,
and so on.
Like a 99-year lease where you have that family right. Yeah. Right, thanks for that. Yeah, so, but still this problem of affordability and what the problem of increasing price of housing does or is that even if it's a socially subsidised system, the burden on the social budget goes up at the same time. Great, thanks for that. And Zoom user, whoever Zoom user is, g'day Mr. Zoom or Mrs. Zoom user. In CA, local politicians pass zoning laws that restrict what can be built and how residents can be built. Yeah, great. So I'm going to come to the in a minute, Mr. or Mrs. Zoom user, because obviously different policy settings around where you can build or zoning policies, they do influence housing affordability. And in Australia, it's a really big debate about how much zoning influences the price of housing. So we'll come back to that. But yeah, obviously zoning can be a real issue, can be an issue. But the other side to the coin is where you don't have any zoning and people just build anything anywhere. You can get a lot of problematic housing that might be really low quality or low access to amenities for the housing like electricity and water. So I guess you can have the other extreme to overzoning, underzoning. And I guess it comes back to one of the solutions which we'll talk about later, which is planning. And Dada Mahapragyananda's put in there, perhaps the most extreme and ridiculous example is billionaires who own Manhattan, super skyscrapers in which one floor is one unit, sells for hundreds of millions or billions, and most are not occupied just for investment. Yeah, great, thanks, Dada. So again, that investment into real estate because it's seen as a relatively safe investment in economies that are maybe not very dynamic, and therefore people with money don't put it into new businesses. Okay, so we're at half an hour, and I guess we've touched on some different examples around the world. We've been lucky. We've got a few obviously developed country issues with the US, Scandinavia, Australia, and then yeah, it's great that we've been able to get Suman and Suveda, who's in Bangkok, but particularly some developing countries.
Hello, Taka.
Sorry, I missed that, Suman. Dhaka. Sorry, that was really faint, Suman Das.
Yeah, he's in Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
Dhaka.
Oh, great. Sorry. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Could Zoom user let us know who you are, please? You can either change your name in the participants list, or just let us know, perhaps.
Sorry, I couldn't. I forgot to mute myself. I was talking to my family member. I'm sorry.
All good.
Okay.
All good. Yeah.
Just one thing I wanted to mention before I forgot,
yes.
that in Bangladesh, basically, this government for the last couple of years, it is allowing, filthy rich people to invest in real estate sector, their black money to white the money, to make the white money. So when the black money is being invested in the real estate sector, it increases the price of the whole, the real estate, flats and all these things. As a result, middle class people, lower income people, they cannot buy flat. It has the price of the flat increased many folds, and the government has started allowing investing the black money in this sector. It has merits and demerits both, but it has created a pressure on middle income people and the low income people. They are now nowhere in the real estate. As a result, many people now they are started leaving, Dhaka. Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. Now they live in outskirts side of the Dhaka. So as a result, they invest more of time for journey, and some of them are not coping with this COVID situation because they cannot come and return. It is also put stress on their health, on their mental health. And this is something I don't know what is the situation in other area, but the opportunity, allowing black money in the real estate sector really has created a huge pressure on the middle income group people. Because middle income people, they had a scope, or they have the ability, or they could afford some some flats or housing in the urban area, but they are now nowhere. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Suman Das. That's a great example. I think I haven't been to London for many decades, but I understand that London, in some areas of London, you have a similar issue with money from probably international syndicates that are buying, property. And so it's an example. I guess it's an example of not just housing affordability, it's one of the causes of unaffordability, and we'll come to it in a sec. But the second thing is about, you don't just need to have an affordable home, but you need to have it in a place that's appropriate for you and what you do in life. So, like, just because I can afford that house, but if it's 2.5 hours to get to work every day, That's a second issue. So it's not just the house, the affordable house or flat itself, but it's actually where is it? So, oh yeah, we're building all these houses for people, social housing, but they're all too far away from where people work. So the location of housing is probably just as important as well. And when you get issues like what Suman's just described, you get the geographic pattern becomes unsustainable, and it leads to a whole lot of social and health issues even. So that's a great example. So I guess what Suman's done there is jumped into the next part of this little session, which is the causes. So thank you, Suman, for that. So Suman's really just highlighted one example of one of the drivers of housing unaffordability, and that is increasing demand for houses, and in this case through probably an unethical or unsustainable from a socioeconomic point of view, allowing black money to be converted through, allowing the market to kind of wash, or what's the word when you go to the casino and you launder money into white money by real estate. What you're doing actually is driving up demand. So it's one of those demand-driven processes where we've got more people with more money that they want to put into real estate, in this case probably not for a good reason, and that's driving demand for real estate up, or for housing up, and that in turn obviously drives the price up. So that's a great example of demand-driven process for the increase in pricing. So Zoom user, who I think is Krishna, if you converted from Zoom using to Krishna, USA, it's the wealthy who pay for such policies. Okay, well, we'll come back to that one. So I guess what I'd like to do now is I'd just like you to have a think about one or two of the reasons why you think housing is becoming unaffordable or is unaffordable in your community, so where you are. We've seen people in different places. So what are the top two reasons that you see are driving housing unaffordability in your area? And the first question to ask yourself with those reasons is, what is driving it? So what are the reasons for this housing unaffordability? So Suman Das has just given us one example where an increase of demand for housing from quite wealthy people seems to be money maybe not well earned, so to speak, is driving demand, and therefore the price is going up, particularly in districts closer to the centre of Dakar, where working people need to be close to work. Surveyors put in there that because people are investing, so yeah, thanks for that. And I guess that's a big issue in Australia at the moment, is that people are investing their money in real estate if they have money to invest. Not everyone does, but those people that have money to invest, and a lot of people are borrowing money from the bank to invest in real estate, and the bank will lend the money because the price of housing is going through a bubble, so the bank will lend you against the bubble. So it's all a bit of a crazy hormonal world. Michael's put in there low interest rates makes borrowing cheap. So yeah, another driver of why Michael's in Australia too, why people can borrow more money to then. So that low interest rate, Michael, is a monetary policy, if you like, driven by the government and by the Reserve Bank. So you've got low interest rates, which then drive borrowing to invest. So you've got this monetary policy that's driving demand side. That has got an inflow of foreigners, mostly other Europeans, who are ready to pay higher prices. So I'm assuming that's into Portugal. So again, a demand-driven process where you've got people with money coming into an area. They have strong demand for those tourism towns, and they're paying higher. And I remember meeting a young Austrian a couple of years ago, who was out here teaching skiing, and he said that in his hometown, one of the ski resorts in Austria, the local young generation can't afford to buy anymore because Russians were buying all the houses. So I guess that's a similar process. Prakash, thanks for joining in, Prakash. You've got in there speak. Sorry, everyone, I'll just have to go back up, Prakash, because there's people throwing in comments, which is great. Speculation, yeah, Wall Street funds purchasing much of the available housing and renting out. Yeah, great. So yeah, again, it's that investment for speculative gain, either what we call capital gain on the asset, or if they're able to get a return on that investment, so it becomes an investment for just to get money from the return on the investment as well. But a lot of people are just buying the property because they assume that in 5 years it'll be worth 3 times what it is now, so that capital gain. But again, demand-driven processes. First reason is unfair. Housing prices are controlled by the elite. Yeah, thanks, Krishna. Yeah, so I guess the economic system is favouring this inequality, I guess, in access to housing, and it's driven through a whole lot of mechanisms. And as you can sort of see where we're going, we're on sort of trying to take it here. Not that I'm trying to give the answers, but just trying to give a framework for looking at the issue. And a lot of those mechanisms that have been set up through our current market-based system do favour these demand-driven processes, but the demand is only for people that can either get access to money to borrow or have a lot of disposable income or purchasing power through either legal or illegal means. Usually people that already own property or are wealthy for some other reason. Andy's put in there, and Andy, I'm assuming are you in the US? I shouldn't assume that, but we've got quite a few Yanks. Sorry to call you all Yanks.
Yes, I'm in the US.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah. Rural areas losing jobs, so people moving to the city, and housing stock is not sufficient. Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. So that would be a supply issue. So you've got demand issues, and I guess you've got people, lots of people move to a city, so urbanification, whatever it's called, urbanization, sorry. You're getting people move into the city, and one, you've got an increase in demand for housing, but two, if you haven't been building enough housing in an area or region, then you obviously have a supply side issue. There's just not enough housing. So obviously, if you go to any mega city in a developing part of the world, you get the slums on the edge of cities, and often that can be just because there's a shortage of affordable housing stock. Obviously, and that particularly was in the 70s, 80s and 90s when those mega cities really blossomed. And so, yeah, you just literally don't have enough. And in Australia at the moment, there's a really big debate between, because of housing affordability is such a social issue, that there are those that say it's because we haven't built enough houses, we don't have enough houses, and those that would say there's enough housing stock. It's actually the affordability and the demand and the speculative investment and these other issues. The demand side issues are more of a problem than the supply side, but it's obviously can be both issues depending where you are. And surveyors put in there using housing in a wrong purpose, i.e. for Airbnb tourism, but not for shelter. Yeah, so I guess the question from a Prout point of view, surveyor, is tourism bad? And I don't know, my opinion probably is that it's not bad, but I guess it's where tourism leads to housing unaffordability, then we've lost that balance, that policy balance. And so now obviously we have a problem, and this is a big problem in many parts of the world where tourism is growing, that obviously we have unaffordability. Yeah, so we've got the use of the house. So this is an issue of social policy. It's an issue, the demand's there for that property from tourist investors, and there's also demand from people that just need a house. So the demand and the supply side, because of the social policies, the supply side policy is not fulfilling basic needs. It's just fulfilling the market for tourism. So this is these challenges of social and economic policies. How do we set them to get that balance? Prakash has put in there stagnancy in minimum wage falls further and further behind. So one of the causes is unaffordability. So yeah, I did have the figures for Australia, but I lost it. I've got a few other figures, but I didn't rewrite that one down. But basically, one of the rules of thumb you can use for owning a house in Australia is the cost of a house as a proportion or as a multiplier of the median wage. So what the median wage or the median annual income of an Australian is, and then how much more a house is, how many years of of that wage a house actually costs to buy. And that has gone up significantly over the last 10 to 15 years in particular. So yeah, and then we've got low real wages not increasing at all. And I have got the figures for that for Australia. So in Australia in the last 2 years, wages apparently grew by 3.5%, but don't tell everyone who's on the median wage and under that because they won't believe you. But wages grew by 3.5%. This is sort of just before COVID and into COVID, but house prices have gone up by about 40%. So you can see that there's just a massive disparity between the earning purchasing capacity, potential purchasing capacity of people and the actual price of housing. So again, another one of these causes, which is purchasing power. So the ability of people to actually afford a house. Anti's put in there, housing in Finland is quite expensive. Well, most things are expensive in Finland, yep. Construction is pretty expensive. The climate is cold. The soil freezes 1 meter, yep. There are quite a few strict regulations on buildings, and there's basically no way to avoid regulations. Some of the zero energy emission rules are really crazy, yep. By average, people use like 25% of their income to housing, yeah, which is actually pretty good, Andy. There are plenty of places around the world where it can be 30% plus 40%. But yeah, this is this issue too of, okay, we want to have sustainable housing, we want to have safe housing that doesn't fall down in the first earthquake or whatever. We have to make sure our housing is future-proof for climate variation and climate change. But we've got these building regulations and planning regulations and building regulations, which really do influence the price of building new houses or retrofitting old houses, etc. And that of course affects affordability as well. So yeah, we've got that, I guess, if you like, that influences the price, not from a demand for the houses or even supply, but it influences the purchasing power. So it's one of these government policies, if you like, or regulations that influences the purchasing power ability. So we might have the same number of houses being built, but because they're more costly because of all these regulations. I guess, again, the opposite to this is that people just build substandard. And in Australia, in Sydney, in Australia, the last 10 years, a lot of the increased high-rise properties that have been built are blocks of apartments. They privatised the building inspection process to cut those costs, Antti, that you're describing in Finland. They said, let's put it to the market. And a lot of those towers in Sydney are actually, people have had to abandon them. And this is, because of the building quality was substandard and the buildings have been unsafe. Krishna's put in there, Zillow speculates in housing. I'm not sure who Zillow is, Krishna, but yeah, it sounds like another one of these investment and increasing demand through speculation. And he's got urbanisation and people moving to the south, empty houses in the countryside and in the north, but they may also be below minimum standards, etc. Yeah, so you've got those couple of different processes going on. And I was lucky enough to go to Japan on a holiday a few years ago, and we were driving through rural mountainous villages and small towns that were about 60% abandoned, and the houses are all just sitting there, sort of slowly crumbling down. More generally, concentration of wealth feeds housing speculation. Yeah, so I guess, Michael, when you've got more money than sense and you don't have anywhere to put it, then why don't you just put it into housing because it's something concrete? I mean, it's interesting to think about the psychological reason that people with a lot of money, whether it's well properly earned or not, people with a lot of money like to put things in, invest in housing. And I guess because housing is a very physical thing that you can see, it's sometimes seen as a safe investment. You own it and it's often in your country, so you feel attachment to it. But it's bricks and mortar, you can see it and feel it. So maybe there's a psychological reason that they put it into that instead of gold, or they just have so much money that they've got to put some into real estate because they can't put it all into gold. Who knows? Local politicians making housing policy to favour the wealthy, yeah, who they for election money. Yeah. So again, this is the problem here, and I guess the causes of these housing policies. So whether it's ones that drive up demand, like for example, borrowing costs are low, and so that banks will lend more readily to investors, supply issues, tight supply, zoning issues, and so there's these policies that really drive that ability of people who already have housing and money to get it. Suma and Dus has put in there, when development activities are centralised, the demand for housing in that particular area increases a lot, which in turn increases the price of land and the cost of housing. So the housing, yeah, great. So I guess Suma and Dus, we're talking there about those broader social and economic development policies for a country that actually then influence where. So when you decide to make a industrial city, this is where we're going to do lots of our steel making, for example, then obviously a lot of people have to go there to work. But if you don't have a well thought through housing policy and land planning policy to go with that, then you can get this problem of increasing housing, long commute times, and you get a geographical spread of the housing for working class people not being near their work. And so this is, you can, I guess everyone can sort of see that there's these social policies that influence supply and demand. There's also what I call economic policies that influence policy demand. And we can break them into two. We can break them into fiscal policies and monetary policies. And then we've got the social policies or social economic development policies, which is similar to what Suma and Dus is describing, where you decide, okay, this region will get lots of investment, we'll centralise industry in here. But if you don't also plan all your housing, your health, your hospitals, all of that. So I guess planning will really comes into it. Good planning at local scale, don't know, it's got different terms, local government scale, as well as national scale. Planning is such an important tool. And I know that it gets a bad rap because centralised planning in communism kind of leads to a lot of problems, but no planning leads to a lot of problems as well. So Prout is very big on planning, but getting the balance right between a dynamic, adaptive planning, I guess. Okay, so we've got a lot of causes coming through there, a lot of root causes, and I've tried to summarise them up just into broad categories of demand-driven problems, and that's things like more and more people wanting houses, or more and more people speculating in houses, or more and more people investing in tourism in houses, all of those things that drive demand, more and more cheap money, so you can borrow more money and get into more debt if you buy a house, which we're seeing in rural Australia in agriculture, as well as in urban housing in Australia as well. And then you've got the demand, and other demand side drivers include population growth. So whether that's migration to areas, urbanisation, or literally just the fast population growth because a country is going through that phase in its development as a nation, and migration. So you've got demand for housing driving demand. So you've got population growth, you've got economic policy, particularly fiscal and monetary policy settings that drive demand, or social policies like letting gangsters launder their black money into white money into housing. And then you've got supply side issues, which we haven't talked a lot about, although I think Andy might have brought it up from America. Someone brought it up. Sorry, there's been a lot of chat, so if I got the wrong person. But it's that where there's just not enough housing stock being built, or has been built, particularly to a standard. And that issue is often debated, I know because I live in Australia, it is debated here in Australia, where they go, look, you've got to loosen the zoning regulations or the planning rules for an area and allow us to build more apartments, for example, because there's not enough. That's why the price is high. And you see that argument played out, but there's a lot more to it than that. So, for example, in some areas in Australia, they'll argue we need to have less planning, less zoning rules so we can build more apartments. But usually that argument is applied to areas that are quite wealthy, so that because the developers want to build more expensive things, they don't want to build more low-cost housing, they want to build more. So they want less regulation so they can build more sort of wealthier real estate, or real estate for more middle to upper class people rather than build more for working social housing, if we call it in Australia. So yeah, it's not as black and white as sometimes the arguments are made, but definitely supply is an issue around the world in different places. So we've got supply side issues, we've got demand side issues, and then we've got our purchasing power issues. Are people earning enough real income to buy the houses or rent or buy houses that are available? Bill's put in there another perhaps popular subject for cause of increase in price of real estate is increased population. Yep, with the same amount of land and more people, the demand to be filled by the same supply goes up. So hang on a minute, Bill keeps bumping up. So either prices go up per capita or more crowding occurs. Yeah, Bill, and I guess this is the big challenge for the world as we enter the Anthropocene or the 21st century human world where we have so many billions of people and a limited planet. How do we, and like I work in agriculture, rural communities, and agriculture is where I've worked for many decades, and the loss of rural land, which is growing food to houses, is a really big issue. And a lot of that land is really often on the river flats because the big cities usually originated on fertile river flat country or river valleys. And so that land is actually really important for food production as well as for housing. So it's a real conundrum. And then now with modern agriculture, we can have vertical farms in high rises, all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, we're entering this new dimension, the Anthropocene, and how we get the two balanced. But it's definitely an issue, is this population pressure. So yeah, definitely in there, and that's that supply side of it. A lot of cities now obviously go up. Some have been going up for many decades. Australia still has this thing where everyone wants to have their own single dwelling house on the ground, so it just goes out rather than up. But it is starting to change. We're seeing change in particular Sydney and Melbourne, and even Canberra, where people are now realising that it's okay to go up. Surveyors put in their housing is Bangkok is oversupply. Yeah, so just so everyone might not be aware, Surveyor and Pia married, she's in Bangkok, but in Australia because of family issues at the moment. But yeah, when we went to Bangkok recently, there's there's been a big building boom of apartments in Bangkok in the last 10 years, Surveyor probably 10, 15 years. And yeah, now the rentals in many areas is quite cheap, relatively speaking, for say middle class people, and that seems to be because there's an oversupply and people have moved back to their hometown because of COVID, and so there's actually quite a lot of available housing stock in Bangkok at the moment. How long it lasts for, of course, is another matter. And he's got in there the standard of living. Earlier, one house could have 4 families living in, now only houses 1 family with only 2 children. And that's way too crowded, mate. I don't want my children living with me anymore. just you know. Yeah, but that's that social change, isn't it? Where before we were used to sharing bedrooms and having large families and shared families in houses, you know, two brothers and their families living together, and that's changed markedly in developed countries in the last 50, 70 years, I guess. So yeah, that's definitely different. And transportation, yeah, when you can afford a car, you can drive 50 k's every morning to get to your job. I guess you can afford it, but it's a lot of time lost from the family too, and there's a lot of CO2 going in the air and a whole lot of other sustainable development goal issues, to use Suman's still here. He looks like he might have dropped out. Oh no, there you are. Sorry, you just put your video on, Suman. Yeah, so yes, you can afford to commute 50 k's, but what are we doing to the planet if we're all commuting 50 k's in our car, I guess? Please send me your email. All right, thanks. Sorry, Suman. Yes. Okay. So, all right. So where are we? All right. We're at 7 o'clock. So we did say we'd go to 90 minutes. It's been really great for me because hopefully you guys are all getting something from this session, because it's great to get, everyone's in a different place and there's different drivers or causes. But I guess the bottom line is that housing affordable, any socioeconomic issue is a systems issue, and there's multiple factors that are influencing it. But I guess those factors can fall into one of 3 types. there'll be a mix of one or three types of factors, and that is supply side issues, demand issues, driving demand. Oh yeah, more people want housing, and purchasing power. Do people have real purchasing power to be able to afford an average house to have shelter and comfort and live a meaningful life? So I guess the drivers of this issue fall into those three categories. So what I'd like to do in this last part of this session, we'll go for about 30 minutes, is have a think about some solutions. So we've talked about all the problems and we're all upset about it. What are we going to do to solve the problem? So what I'd like you to do now is to think about what you think that your top two issues are. So your top two, just stick to two. I know you might have written manifesto in solving the world in 5 days, but I just need your top two issues that you think might be the biggest levers or the biggest tools to help address this problem and help to improve affordability of housing for middle class to working class people who are the ones that are suffering this problem. It's not really the wealthy people that are suffering here, it's more middle class to working class people in particular. So what do you think the top, and also the younger generation, we probably haven't mentioned it here. I don't know who the youngest person here in the room is, but yeah, you know, like the people that are 20, where I live here now in Australia, people that are 20 to 30, they're really, a lot of them are resigned that they can't afford a house unless they inherit it from their parents. So, which is the first time in Australia's modern economic history since the Second World War that's actually an issue, a social factor. Up until now, young people have been able to afford a house and or afford rental, which is also becoming the first time in Australia's history. And taxation is another factor. Yeah, thanks, Sudhita. And yeah, that's another cause, again, coming into fiscal policy, as one of the social policies as part of fiscal policy. So yeah, have a think about top two causes. So we've got half an hour to solve the world's housing affordability problems. And then I'll pass it over to Dada and Maheshwara to just get on and fix the problem. We'll have to give them a bonus if they solve the problem. But yeah, so your top two issues. What are your top two solutions? Sorry, not issues. What policy tools or things would you try to do to rectify the problem? So have a think about that for a minute, and then punch something into chat or put your hand up if you want to throw it out verbally. What are the biggest two things we can do, in your opinion? Solutions. Bill was hoping I could tell him that. Good on you, Bill. This is a ProutSpace, mate. It's called collective brain power. I mean, I'll give you my 2 bobs worth, mate, but I'm an agroecologist. I'm not a housing policy specialist. Although I certainly have felt the reality of trying to get a house and get a nice home, a little home in Australia. Yeah, I'll certainly give you my 2 bobs, Bill, but whether it'll be useful for you or not, I can't answer that one. Defining housing as a fundamental right. Prakash, I'm happy to run with that one, but people already do that, but it's just all talk. You've got to walk the walk too, really. But I guess if that's enshrined somewhere, then it does make people accountable, I guess. So a bit like part of a Bill of Human Rights or Bill of Rights. And that way, at least people that don't have access to affordable, reasonable housing have that legal and moral, I guess. What's the word? Lever to pull. I can't think of the right word, but yeah, okay. So defining it and clearly articulating housing is a fundamental human right, yeah, which maybe we kind of think of implicitly, but it needs to be explicit. Restrictions on speculations or seeing apartment owning as a way to get return on investments. Great. So thanks, Auntie. So social and fiscal policies in the housing, in the government's settings around housing to minimize speculation and therefore investment in more housing just for investment's sake, and effectively offering job opportunities in rural areas, which would stop that urbanisation. Great. So we've got setting it as a fundamental human right explicitly in legal terms and social for society to really reflect on. We've got that restrictions on speculative investment. And in Australia, the way it's done, and it's a little bit different, but it's the same process, is about, I think it's about 35, 40 years now, they've had what we call a capital gains tax, which incentivizes people to invest in real estate because they won't pay tax on the value of the land improvement or the house improvement. That's a tax dodge. So that's really encouraged people to invest in housing, second and third houses, because they won't have to pay tax on the increase in value of that property. And that's really driven more investment into the housing sector from a speculative investment point of view. The original thinking was that would help have more rental houses available, but yeah, it hasn't necessarily resulted in that. It's just it's driven probably quite a lot of the price increase. But I guess that's a similar thing. So having some kind of way to regulate speculative investment or over-investment. Decentralisation of development, Suman's putting there, access to low interest housing finance. It's great. So that's working, I guess, on the planning side to it. So where the housing is and allocating housing strategically, Suman, so that working class people can live in areas close to where the work is. So that's really what I'd call a planning policy strategy, real land planning policy, which is such an important area of policy, I think, that's pretty much neglected. And then access to low interest housing. So again, allowing affordability and an affordability policy for people so they can access housing at a reasonable cost. Great. Wages justice and limits to speculation. Yep. So I guess that's so obviously wages justice would give people more purchasing power, Michael, if I'm on the right track. So they'd have more real purchasing power, and then speculation, which we've just been talking about, to limit that sort of increase in pricing house just because people are over investing in it. Income ceiling and increasing that livable wage, which I think Andy is on the same lines there. It's a different way of saying that livable wage. Obviously, a livable wage. And I'm reading a book by Stephanie Kelton, who's a US modern monetary theory economist, I think, and another one called Basic Income by some French economists. And yeah, they talk about, I think in the US, there's a benchmark of about 30% of your income each week. If more than 30% is being spent on rent, then you're obviously under stress. And it's probably varies if you're in rural areas or in expensive city areas. But yeah, so having that livable wage and wages justice, I guess, would be another way to put that. Andy's putting their income ceiling. Oh, yep, sorry, that's to, yeah, income ceiling and livable wage control and speculation. Yep. And then Prakash has put in there creating an economic bill of rights, holding society accountable. Yep, great, terrific. And I think that might come back a little bit, Prakash, to that one you put up there, fundamental human right. Yeah, great. So that bill of rights, terrific. Because I guess then what would do it, Prakash, is that all socioeconomic policy would need to be measured against that bill of rights to see whether it's meeting it, which kind of makes politicians and their policies accountable. Gee, wouldn't that be nice? I thought democracy makes people accountable. Yeah, right. Okay, centralised economy in the rural areas, not concentrate only in capitals. Yeah, great. So Bangkok, obviously, being a primary mega cities, the only really big city, mega city in Thailand is a classic example where the population really concentrates. MMT, yeah, Michael said you've mentioned MMT, and what does MMT say? Well, I guess MMT, Michael, basically says that the government monetary policy is not limit. If you're an issuer of currency, if you issue your own country as a sovereign government, then you can use monetary policy to invest in any social infrastructure, health, housing, and it's not going to be a burden on the taxpayer because, in fact, every time you issue currency or the ledger from the Reserve Bank goes into investing in anything like a house or a hospital, social house or hospital or a road, then actually you're creating wealth for the nation. And that's really at the heart of MMT, is that as a sovereign nation with its own sovereign currency invests from its Federal Reserve, if you like, or Reserve Bank, then it actually creates wealth for the country. It's not a zero-sum debt because it's got to pay that back with tax sort of thing. It's quite a different paradigm, if you like. I guess that's at the heart of it. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, that was probably a really dodgy summary of MMT, but I think that's kind of the nut of it. Printing money is an invisible tax. Yeah, Bill, I guess that's the thing. Probably we don't have time, and it's not the place to go into MMT in detail, but yeah, it's worth investigating the MMT paradigm because it's slightly different than that printing money. Because printing money, which is, you could argue, is what it is, where you're generating new currency through, you know, the reserve issuing money into the economy. But I guess it depends on how it's used, whether MMT would argue it depends on how that money is used, whether it drives inflation or not, which is the key thing. Printing money and then throwing it out in the economy can cause hyperinflation, but it doesn't necessarily have to do that. And I think the MMT economists would argue, not that I'm saying MMT is perfect, they would argue that the last 10 years, 15 years around the world has proven that you can get the printer out and do quantitative easy, and inflation hasn't gone up. So their argument is that the two are not always aligned. It does depend a little bit how that new money, if you like, that a sovereign currency invests into its economy is used. But I won't go any more than that. Suffice to say, I think it's worth looking at that, but can be an invisible tax. Okay, so the solutions have been pretty wide-ranging. Some of them are what I'd call broad social policies, planning, structural planning, Bill of Rights, those kind of things. And sorry, Bill's put in there. Yeah, definitely, Bill. That's MMT doesn't say don't use taxes for spending, for sure. But I guess it's just saying that there is a third dimension to it apart from government borrowing and or taxing for income to do things. And there is a third sort of mechanism, I guess, but it's not definitely not against taxing either. It's probably just using it as a slightly different tool in some situations would be, I'd say it. So yeah, we've got solutions that are social policy based. We've got monetary policy issues, which are obviously setting interest rates. And then you've got fiscal policy issues, which is social housing spending, for example, however that money is generated through tax revenue or through borrowings or whatever, or through strategic issuing of new currency. So you've got fiscal policy. So really, I guess the solutions lie in all three of those kind of domains, and probably without being able to give Bill a black and white single solution, you know, it's going to be a mix of those things, and it may be a mix of those things differently depending on whether you're in a developing country or a developed country, or whether you are a sovereign currency issuer, for example. So countries that don't have their own sovereign currency or don't use their own currency, or they peg their currency to, say, the US dollar, they don't have that same tool of their reserve bank as other countries do. They may not have the tax base. Some countries don't have the tax base. Some countries have a lot of black money. Sumandas was talking about Bangladesh. So, you know, obviously the solutions may be different, but the mix of solutions will obviously have to include fiscal, monetary and social policy, social and geography policy, I guess. And I guess they're trying to address that supply, demand and purchasing power dimensions to housing, because it's got those three dimensions to it. So I guess, yeah, we've covered a lot of ground there. I'm going to just pull it up because we've got about 10 minutes to go, and I'm just going to open it up because I've been talking a lot. And I'm sorry if I talk really quickly, but that's just when I'm facilitating something. Andy, thanks very much. Andy's got to go. But yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. If anyone does want to throw in some just general talk around the issue, I'll sort of form the thing. But Andy, thanks very much for joining us. Yeah, but if anyone's got some final comments or thoughts that they'd like to add or observations, please feel free to throw them in now. and then we'll pull it up. And hopefully Mahesh has got plenty of work out of this. He's recording it. Dada, you want to say something?
Yes, I think the thing that's struck me the most, especially in this later part, is how, though the issues and the challenge or the problem is quite universally spread around the globe, the application of potential solutions is going to have to be localized. I think very much people, and for anyone who wants to offer advice from their experience or what they know of other cases, scenarios in practice, where how there has been implementation of better or progressive policies and the outcomes of those in local communities and local municipalities or cities, regions of countries. I think it's probably like so many of the types of changes that Prout advocates, that's where it's going to happen or be able to happen more effectively.
Yeah, thanks, Dara. Yeah, and I guess, as modern economic systems get quite centralized, the capitalist system in some ways, then the wealth gets quite centralized. It's harder to influence things at a local level because there's less resources at the local levels and things. But I think from the Second World War through probably to the 2000s, there was quite a lot of different policies put in around the world. Say Scandinavia is probably a good example. Looking at different solutions. I know in Sweden, for example, a lot of the towns and areas of Sweden, they mix sort of working class, middle class and upper middle class housing. They strategically planned it so that there was diversity of socioeconomic groups in different areas. So, there has been a lot of policy experimentation, probably in the second half of the 20th century, and it'd be really worth investigating that more and doing research on that and different examples, and then also, more cooperative based housing approaches that have been applied in different local areas around the world, and pre-modern, the pre-modern or the pre-industrial housing models that were out there, and all of those things, just to learn, to get some examples and maybe get some policy examples and that could be used or adapted to the modern world. Yeah, definitely think it's worth doing. I think we should give that as a job to Mahesh for his next 2 years. Anyone else got any thoughts or comments?
By the way, he's not feeling so well. He has COVID for the second time, and so he's really keeping quiet.
Yeah. No worries, Mahesh. You just to calm down there. Yeah. No.
The other thing it's because you've referred to several times about modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
And I know there's some other Proutists who are quite keen on it, and then there are those who really feel that it's really not an applicable solution. So I think we'll try to organize a future program, maybe to have some discussion or debate along those lines. It'll be lively and interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting conceptual approach to economics. I think it's definitely worth looking at. I think it's a Proutist. I think we need to be integrative in our approach and looking at, everything has something to contribute. So no, definitely that. I think it's something that Proutists need to look at more. Any other final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, it's Prakash from the US, thinking that
Prakash.
From the end of the Second World War until 1980 in the United States, there was really the feeling the government was working for the common good.
Yeah.
And the parts of society that were advancing the fastest were the lowest income.
Yeah.
There was really a sense of, you can have too much. And so you shouldn't have too much because that's what takes away from the common good.
Yeah.
And so you had, advances in the living wage, you had, control on wealth accumulation because of high tax rates. And there, ever since, like, backlash against that has continued for last 40 plus years around the world. And so it's like, you might say it's a value system that says, oh, when we work together, we're working for the common good, as opposed to, oh no, the government isn't to work for the common good, is to protect the assets of those who have a lot, which
Yeah.
is sort of a change. And so people feel cynical about government, when actually government used to be just for all of us. But now it's like, oh, government is not there for all of us. So
Yes.
that's a big, huge change. And I think, you know, from a Proutist perspective, change in values is a core part of the change that's needed. Just saying, wait a second, no, there should be human rights to have housing, basic necessities. And we can't have unlimited material wealth. If we don't address those two things, then all the other policies will never get carried out because they're based on values, you know.
Yeah, great point. Thanks for that, Gosh. Yeah, it's the same. I do a lot of true change. We call it extension. You probably call it outreach in America, with farmers changing to regenerative ag, and it starts in the mind. So once people change their perspective, then the physical change, the farming is easy, but it's that change. And I guess it probably, you know, this all aligns. I mean, I think Australia, which is kind of follows the US sort of model now of capitalism much more than it used to. It used to more follow the European model, if you like. And it's, so I've seen in my lifetime the kind of much more extreme American version of neoliberalism come into Australia. And yeah, maybe it was that Reagan, those 80s with Reagan and Thatcher, and when the neoliberals really took off. So yeah, we've got this fundamental values shift and you see it in, as you probably guys know, in America, in this very, you know, more people think more for themselves rather than the community. And yeah, you get this, and so I guess, we can't really address this unless we're starting to get that values, people seeing things from a different perspective and aligning their values differently. Yeah.
One bright spot in the United States is there's a huge growth in cooperatives.
Yeah.
And people are, you know, and there's not pushback against that because it's sort of under the radar of the right wing, perhaps. But it's actually, it's demonstrating the ideas of the value of cooperation, and it's securing a much more secure livelihood for people who are working in those cooperatives, because the ownership within the community, within the people working there, the people who are the consumers working together.
Yep. And it's interesting how you've said, you know, like that, it doesn't threaten the right wing as a traditional left wing progressive policy might. It's kind of like a third way. And that's what we see in rural change, for example, when we work on rural change projects, say with farming groups, is you're trying to create a third way that's not threatening. It's not threatening the current dominant paradigm. It's actually saying, well, here's a new solution. It's not the enemy or the other paradigm that you're used to being against. It's actually a different way. And so I think from a Prout point of view, it's trying to identify that, and it's finding that common ground with people, finding the common ground and going, well, here's a framework we can use that's common ground that we all agree on. And it's not the old kind of, you know, polarized dynamics, which can be hard to get out of, but you can do it. I mean, we've been able to successfully do it in different ways, in different sort of much smaller projects around regenerative ag, but it does work. And I think for me, again, we're talking about modern monetary theory. My understanding, I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but what I see in it, it is actually quite a different perspective than either the socialist or the capitalist in some ways. And so it does have some ideas that can contribute to some third way of thinking, if you like, which I think Prout is trying to articulate, if I've got Prout right. So, you know, and it is trying to get that different perspective that's new and is not confronting. So yeah, I don't know. I've never been to the US, so I kind of half want to go there and a half I don't want to go there. But you know, Australia does politically isn't as polarized, although certainly, you know, people strong have their political passions, but we don't have that polarization to the extent you guys do. People can sort of think in that third or fourth way, I guess. But yeah, this is it. The values that underpin us as a society is what influences housing affordability, basically. It comes down to that. Okay, so we're nearly at time. I think Suman's had to go. No worries, he just said thanks. Namaskar, thanks Suman for that. Sorry I missed you going. Michael said MMT, yep, certainly would be. Have a session on MMT sometime. So I might pull it up, everyone. It's 7:30 nearly here in Australia, or where I am in Australia anyway. It's probably a different time where you guys are. So thanks very much for making the effort. ProutSpace is an initiative that the Proutist Universal has put on. Dada and Maheshwara, the silent witness Maheshwara and Dada. So obviously Proutist Universal wants to create constructive, policies. And I guess one way to do that is not to do it from the top down so much, getting experts to, give us the answer, but to try and collaboratively develop that. And so ProutSpace is a way that we can start that process. So the Proutist Universal can come up with some, well-informed policy statements that can then be used to help Prout activists wherever they are. It can give them some framework and some ideas. So Dada, thanks once again, and Maheshwara. But yeah, I'll pass back to Dada now and say thanks everyone for coming along.
Well, thank you, David, and everyone for your participation. And just following on what he just said, if you have, for example, Michael said it would be great to have something about MMT. If you have either a proposal as such, or you'd like to offer to facilitate or present something, please let us know. If you've received the mailing about this evening, you've got the contact address there. And otherwise, anyone that you know who's on the call, reach out to them and they'll give you the email address. I'll put it also now in the chat group there. But yes, we want to continue this series and broaden it and make sure that the participation of everyone is highly satisfied. So if you've got proposals or you want to offer something from your own side, as David and Suveda very nicely did for this program, please let us know. Hope you've had a very wonderful New Year celebration and the rest of the year goes great for you. And
thanks,
any
Dada.
closing remarks from anyone?
I'd just like to give my thanks to David for a fantastic summary and presentation. It's a lot of work. I know it's a lot of work to prepare something like this. So congratulations.
Oh, no worries. Look, I don't pretend to know anything about housing. I just have a general interest in Prout and all the things at issue. So I was happy to do it. So
yeah, well, being in Australia myself, I recognised all the arguments that you brought up.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I've been reading about your bird recording stuff in the Cosmos magazine. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got my 15 minutes of fame. At least my wife did.
No, it was a great article. So.
Actually, I wasn't even, until I heard you speak now, Michael, I wasn't sure. Now it's Michael Towsey, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's right. It's
been a long time I didn't recognize. So.
Yeah, well, we won't go into how I look these days, but I thought that I have to get back into the mainstream Prout and understand again what's going on and who the people are. Yeah. I have to say, I don't recognize Bill, but maybe Bill's been around a while. The other thing is that I'm actually writing something at the moment, and I was just working on the housing issue. So, and I also got excited by MMT. So there's a lot of discussion we can have there.
Yeah.
And here I need to mention, I've told it to Pactaveria when we saw in Italy a few years ago at the train station, that he wrote the book. That was the first book that I read that got me interested in Prout. Yeah.
Now I know. Now
so
I know who you are.
This is how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I remember now. Yeah. And to Suveda as well. Hello. Oh, she's muted. Yeah.
And Bill, that recording, Michael's been working on research where they record a landscape and then they can work out diversity of bird life, but also health of the ecosystem through recordings. So as an ecologist, it's quite interesting. But yeah, it's an interesting bit of science. So I can send the link to Cosmos magazine. It's an Australian science magazine for general readership, Bill. It's called Cosmos, I think. But you'll find it if you just put maybe Michael, you can send a link to a website or something for Bill if he wants to. Oh, he heard it on the radio, the BBC. Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, no, it's getting around. There's a few good podcasts too, Michael. On the ABC, there's a couple of podcasts with a couple of the young PhD students of it on off track. I think the ABC podcast, Off Track, the Nature podcast. There's been a few podcasts with some of the PhD bird students that have used that technology with you. Anyway, definitely off topic. So
there's a brother in the United States, Pranav. Probably you know him already, but he's a great enthusiast on MMT. So any discussion, if you can persuade him, I think he feels that he's been beaten up a bit by the anti-MMT people. At least in my communications with him, I think he was feeling a bit bruised.
Anti-MMT people within the Prout movement, or in general?
No, within the Proutists. I mean, I have not been keeping in touch enough to know the intensity of feelings on these things, but yeah, I think the summary we got here was quite good. That MMT's got a lot of great things, but it needs cultural shift, and until that happens, I can't see anything working. But anyway,
I think that we could arrange a very lively, I think, and interesting interaction on that. I know Govinda and James Killigan are very critical of it, and Govinda's been working intensely for the last 2 years plus on a new monetary theory and policy system that he feels is based on Prout. So that's
the one where he's saying that currency should be backed by environmental assets.
Yeah, natural resources. Yep.
That's be curious. I find it difficult to understand. So
Saudi Arabia will be in the black because they got all that oil. Righto. All right, I might pull it up everyone because it's 7:30, but we've got a topic for the future.
We actually have some recordings of previous presentations he's done, so we could share those. So anyone who's interested.
Yeah.
But it's evolved. But anyway, thank you everyone. It's been really, really wonderful, the interaction and participation and the very nice preparation you've done, David. So
no worries. Thanks everyone. We'll see everyone next time.
Yep. And this recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, unlisted.
Okay. Good. Namaskar.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.